Good morning. Thank you for joining us today. This is the fourth of a four-part webinar series that we have been hosting, and today's topic is how to leverage business model uncertainty to drive digital transformation and smart data strategies. My name is Juan Serrato. I'm the co-leader of the Digital Transformation and Data Economy team and a partner in the San Francisco office at Baker Hostetler. I assist clients in the midst of digital transformation, helping to guide organizations through periods of transformation and change, whether it is driven by innovation or crisis management. Because so many of the digital technology questions involve data, I counsel clients in the areas of consumer privacy, cybersecurity, data monetization, and data science. The other co-leaders of the team are Janine Anthony Bowen, a partner in our Atlanta office, and Chad Wachowski, partner in our Philadelphia office. We're a multidisciplinary team focused on helping clients determine where their opportunities and vulnerabilities lie and to design a plan to manage, protect, and leverage digital and data assets. As part of our webinar series, we've discussed the concept of digital transformation and data economy on May 6th and heard from recruiters what hiring trends tell us about the post-COVID economy, where industries and companies are making decisions to pivot, accelerate, or exit. On May 13th, we looked at how companies decide to build, buy, or integrate when they pivot to reinvent the narrative of the company. And last Wednesday, we looked at how IP rights can be established, especially when you're accelerating, and the benefits and perils of open innovation. Today, we're going to look at exit. How do companies know when it is time to restructure, reorganize, or file for bankruptcy? And what it means to leverage business model uncertainty during crises and beyond. I'll now ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Eric Barnum.
Thanks, Juan, and good morning to you on the West Coast. Good afternoon here in Atlanta. My name is Eric Barnum, and I am a partner with Baker Hostetler in the Labor and Employment Group here in Atlanta, Georgia. I've been with Baker Hostetler for just about 4 years now. Today, I'll discuss what I think of reorganization and restructuring in terms of businesses needing to pivot on a dime, quite literally and metaphorically, because businesses have had to change how they think about their workforce, their customer base, and how their workforce services that customer base. My focus on digital technology and data insights will focus on how companies can provide services and products to people virtually, including how to use the data for improving certain aspects of their business, how data is used when sometimes companies face decisions about scaling back their workforce, and retooling their services or their products, and identifying as essential those workers who can provide those services and products in a different way. I look forward to speaking with you today.
Hi, my name is Andrew Layden. I'm a partner in the bankruptcy and restructuring group here at Baker Hostetler. I'm a board certified bankruptcy lawyer. I primarily focus in coming alongside companies that are restructuring or in financial distress and kind of working with them to get them through that time, that transformation that can take the form of some type of bankruptcy or insolvency proceeding, or sometimes an out-of-court workout situation. So primarily represent companies reorganizing, but also represent distressed asset buyers as well as creditors in some situations. And that's kind of my viewpoint that I bring to this, and I look forward to our discussion.
Hi, my name is Louis Pillage. I'm a senior banker at the Special Situations group at Strate. We're a global advisory firm with core service lines that include investment banking, valuation advisory, dispute and management consulting. I have nearly 20 years of private equity, financial advisory, and special situations experience. And in terms of our group, we advise companies in primarily in M&A transactions, both in and out of court, and we also do private placement transactions. In terms of industries that we cover, we tend to be agnostic and have led transactions, in manufacturing, distribution, defense, and media, among others. So appreciate the opportunity to be part of this webinar, and look forward to our discussion today.
Hello, everyone. My name is Todd Thorson, and I lead the business practice group for Baker Hostetler in Dallas, Texas. I'd like to introduce my friend and client, Chris Moy. Chris is the CEO of Crossmark, which is a leading sales and marketing service company in the consumer goods and services industry based near Dallas, Texas. Crossmark currently has over 20,000 employees serving consumer packaged goods and retailers from the very big to the very small, from Walmart to the local mom and pop grocer. Chris received his MBA from Harvard Business School and has served with several iconic American businesses in his nearly 40-year career, including General Motors, Rubbermaid, and Campbell Soup. Very early in Chris's career, he began to focus on how technology could improve and transform traditional business operations. He was able to put this focus into practice as a senior member of several innovative firms, including McKinsey & Co. and IBM. He also served as a managing director with Alvarez and Marsal during the financial crisis of 2008, which I think both of us would admit puts him in a very good position to deal with the current disruption that we're having. Chris is, in my view, a rare CEO in today's business environment for a couple of reasons. First off, he actually uses the phrase digital transformation on a regular basis. And secondly, he can also clearly articulate what that means to not only his business, but to other businesses as well.
Thank you. And our program today will last 1 hour and is approved for 1 hour CLE credit in California, New York, Pennsylvania, and Texas. Available via reciprocity in New Jersey. Credit is pending approval in Georgia, Ohio, and Washington. For all other states, attorneys can receive a certificate of attendance and electronic materials so they can file directly with the CLE credential entities. During the course of the webinar, you will see 2 slides that will contain 2 different CLE codes. You will need to make note of these 2 codes and enter them into a brief CLE questionnaire immediately following the program's conclusion. If you have any questions during the presentation, you can type your questions in the bar on the right-hand side of your screen in the questions area. We'll try our best to answer them at the end of the program, and if not, we'll follow up with you after the webinar. We have included our email addresses on this slide, so please feel free to contact us anytime with comments, suggestions, or questions. We'll also send an email to everyone in the next day or 2 with a link to a video recording of the webinar and the PDF of the presentation. So today we're going to be covering in the presentation how companies pivot, accelerate, or exit to respond to business model uncertainty. Next slide, please. We will discuss how important having trusted data and quality data is in making decisions to buy or sell, and how companies can stay one step ahead while identifying opportunities and liabilities in terms of employment, corporate, privacy, and restructuring legal issues. Let's start first with business model uncertainty. How disruptive is COVID-19 to certain industries, and what are the direct financial impacts on businesses and their going forward strategies? Louis, can you speak to what you're seeing in the market? What changes in financial impact are being considered, and how are businesses incorporating new digital transformation strategies?
Yeah, I mean, I think digital transformation is particularly key in this environment as businesses are adapting to new ways of, surviving. Robust information networks, IT departments, accounting systems, and HR functions, I would say, are more important now than ever. In the restaurant industry, for example, having a robust digital platform is critical. We've seen the clients that have adapted well to the pandemic have been able to pivot and execute on drastically altered business plans. In the casual dining space, for example, companies have been able companies that have been able to survive have the necessary accounting and P&L systems in place. As a result, they've been able to keep track of their revenue mix and ever-changing margin. And I think for these companies, it's incredibly important just to have those network systems and software to communicate seamlessly between locations and adapt to a new way of doing business. And for a lot of those companies, it's been a change in terms of really adjusting to a pickup and delivery model as opposed to a restaurant-focused experience. Yeah, we've seen companies, certainly clients in the casual dining space that have not thrived, but have survived in this environment, be able to pivot relatively seamlessly based on the strength of their capital stack. So I think it's more important than ever, right? In this day and age.
Thanks, Louis. Andrew, as a restructuring lawyer, what are the kinds of tools that you see your clients using when they're looking into reorganization or really adapting to the new environment?
Sure. I think now, given what has happened with COVID, the word that comes to mind is uncertainty. That just injected so much uncertainty into everyone's business model. And from the asset purchase and deal perspective that I see, that's really slowed down as a result of that uncertainty. You see a lot of people kind of hanging back, conserving cash, and sitting tight till this uncertainty passes, and gather data during that time period. They can kind of understand what has really been affected and in what ways to go out and to see more of that deal activity. So really a slowdown on that end. From my perspective, dealing a lot with creditor and debtor relationships, we've seen a lot of forbearance agreements. Creditors lately have been much more willing to forbear from exercising their rights, which typically takes the form of something called a forbearance agreement, where they kind of stand still, give the debtor a little bit of a break, maybe short time period, to then reevaluate where they're at 30, 60, 90 days. So on the legal side, more of a willingness from creditors to not rush to pursuing rights and remedies under loan documents, things like that, but more willing to give the debtor a little bit of time under a forbearance agreement, and those terms can change, but then reevaluate where they're at a little bit down the road. And so that's kind of what I've been seeing.
Let's turn to talking about customers and suppliers. As Andrew was talking about, there are perhaps different stages at which business is making decisions. And Chris, your company just went through restructuring last year. So the kinds of changes that your company went through, it wasn't necessarily, really done because of COVID, but it was because of some changes that the company was experiencing. And you're now the CEO of Crossmark. But before, during the financial crisis, you also served as a managing director at Alvarez & Marsal. So what are some, can you talk about maybe the aha moment that your company had, where your business realized that doing business as usual just wasn't going to work anymore? And what are some changes that you saw happen from a customer's perspective and also from a supplier perspective?
I think that's a good question. And I would take note that I thought that I would never see another financial crisis type of event in my working lifetime. And here it is, not only happening, but happening even more severely than the financial crisis. What's different this time, of course, is that this is a health crisis, not a financial crisis. To your question about, what was the aha moment, I'm not sure that the organization has completely embraced that. I think there is an intellectual understanding that things need to change, but an emotional event like this certainly helps push people towards making more dramatic changes. And I would point out, for us anyway, it was really only 7 or 8 weeks ago that this really started to take hold for us. I mean, 7 or 8 weeks ago, it feels like 7 or 8 years ago at this point. But at the beginning of March, we started to see retailers starting to pull back from in-store events. So on our marketing side, which is 40 to 45% of our business and people, they started to pull back from in-store sampling, for example. People might remember the NBA player who was kind of making jokes about, how it spreads. And then sure enough, the NBA shut down their games shortly thereafter. We also service, big companies in experiential ways. And so when big events like that got shut down, that really was a shockwave through our company.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that, Chris? Because I think the kind of services that the Crossmark provides might not be known to the webinar participants. Can you kind of explain, what your core business was, let's say in 2019, versus what you're pivoting to in 2020?
Yeah, so fundamentally, we have two halves of the business. One is on the sales side, and the other is on the marketing side. The marketing side, of course, is all about generating demand. And generally, you want to go where there are a lot of people. And so in this situation, that is really hard to do. Reaching direct consumers in an environment that people are not feeling very safe for obvious reasons, that's affected us pretty dramatically and essentially all but shut down that side of the business. And we'll talk about that later, what we chose to do and how we chose to do it. But the sales side, on the other hand, we service a lot of consumer packaged goods companies, including food companies, who saw, dramatic shifts in demand and, supply being constrained very significantly relative to the demand spikes they were seeing. So we were considered essential, or are considered essential workers in those retail environments. The people that are going in on the front lines, stocking shelves or setting up end caps or merely just getting the product into the store, and all the supply chain elements related to that, from selling to helping to facilitate trucks, et cetera. That we do that kind of work on an outsourced basis.
Mm-hmm. So as we were preparing for the webinar, you had some really interesting insights of how perhaps before COVID, it really was demand driven, that your core business was really about increasing demand, whereas now we're in a supply driven economy for those essential products. So, there might be products on the shelf where, there might be zero demand. And then there are some other products where there's not enough supply. So would you say that we're experiencing at the moment a demand shock right now, or a supply shock, or is it both?
I think it is both, actually. I mean, as you saw, and what makes this a very complex environment which to navigate is there are certainly global supply chains that have been affected. So as we've seen, China was affected first, and certain products like personal protective equipment, PPE, masks, and the like were extremely hard to come by. We needed to get those PPE type of support tools to our frontline people. They were very hard to come by in the early days. So certainly on the supply side, that's one example. But I would say, the consumer packaged goods industry has been kind of the definition of a stable business because it's driven by population. And generally speaking, the demand is relatively stable, except for when the consumer packaged goods or the retailer chooses to run an ad or promotion, and they usually have some sense of what the elasticity, et cetera, is. In today's environment, that is not true. So their normal business is how do we drive incremental demand?
Right.
Because their profit margins are such that a lot of that incrementality drops right to the bottom line. So they are oriented towards driving demand. And that's what the whole business model is set up to do. Suddenly we go into a store and there's nothing to be found anywhere. No Coke, no Pepsi, no alternative, nothing. And so that changes consumer behavior, and it makes it very much a supply-driven equation. If you have supply, you get sales. That's quite a different situation than most of us have ever known in our lifetime. Quite a different and difficult forecasting model as well.
That's a really good point. And so, Louis, I think what Chris said is really interesting. I'm taking away 2 points. One is, how this is really kind of supply driven, but really your comment about incremental, increase in demand, how that used to be something that the companies watch very closely, spending advertising dollars. So Louis, can you speak to, what are some ways that the companies are using data analytics to monitor customer behavior? And on the flip side, what are some lessons learned during COVID about how to stress test supply chain risks?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of data analytics, we've seen it used quite frequently, in particular in the consumer product space, and more specifically in companies that have an online presence. We've seen a number of companies use data analytics in, for example, in increasing response rates, improving customer loyalty, and really ultimately ROI. By being able to contact the right customers with relevant offers and and messages. I think overall for companies as they're watching their bottom line, data analytics really can lead to a reduction in sales and marketing costs by targeting the customers that can respond the most appropriately. The other way that we've seen data analytics being used is to decrease attrition by accurately predicting the customers that are most likely to leave and developing the right proactive campaigns to retain them and keep them. So in those areas we've seen quite a bit of analytics being used, and also really using the right using data analytics to provide segmenting of customers a lot more effectively, and really to better understand target populations. So those are some of the trends that we've seen in the consumer product space, and particularly with companies that are online. With regards to supply chains, Chris touched on some of this before. I think for a lot of companies, the thought was always that supply chains were fairly static. And I think the pandemic, for many companies, has really exposed the fragility of those relationships. Nowhere is that more evident for healthcare workers and some of the struggles they faced in getting some basic supplies to them as they were on the front lines in hospitals dealing with cases. So, I think what to do if you're a company and how to think about supply chains, I really do think it's two basic questions. One is really, what's my recovery time? So in other words, how long will it take my business to return back to normal production after a significant supply chain disruption? And two, what's my survival runway? So how long does a business have to match their supply and demand if a chain has been impacted? I think if you really drill into those two questions, it'll lead to a bigger discussion that's focused on really critical areas. So do we have a lot of supply chain concentration right now in the way that we do business? Are there alternative suppliers that we can go out to for our products? So maybe having more of a domestic alternative rather than being strictly focused on foreign. And to the point of this webinar, what are some of the investments that you can make to technology to make these supply chains a lot more flexible and malleable during times of crisis? I think in some ways businesses should employ more actively the lessons that we learned, during 2008. I think it's really critical, whether it's on a quarterly basis or a biannual basis, to really stress test those supply chains to have a good understanding of whether you're prepared to stomach some of these changes, like we've seen in the pandemic.
So let's turn to communication. When companies are pivoting, reinventing themselves, or retooling the workforce, and really repositioning the company's position in the marketplace, communication is key. When you're really kind of talking about, making these changes, as Chris and Louis, you highlighted. Eric, what are some best practices in terms of how company can communicate to their multiple stakeholders, whether it is employees or customers or suppliers or to the creditors?
Sure, thanks, Joanne. So I think the thing that everyone should remember, and I advise my clients all the time, you have to keep in mind your external brand as well as your internal brand. Your internal brand being the brand that you want to carry and to have your internal folks, your employees, keep top of mind. The truth of the matter is, a company's employees, its human resources, truly are the greatest assets. And whether you're a small company or a multinational employer, those are your ambassadors. So it's important to think about your brand and that internal brand as well as external brand. Secondly, what's that old saying? Honesty is the best policy. It's always best to tell the truth. You may need to explain some facts that aren't very flattering, but it's important to always tell the truth. Let me give you an example of a significant crisis most of us remember. I think we all remember the Tylenol scare when there were some bottles had been tampered with, and people were really scared to go out and buy Tylenol. The company over communicated what it was doing to address the issue, to identify the issue, and make sure that its stakeholders, its clients, its customers, and its employees knew what the company was doing to address it. They handled that crisis situation in a phenomenal way. And now Tylenol is as strong a brand as it's ever been. That's a great example of a company that set the narrative in a way that it was based on known facts, what it was going to do to address those known facts, what facts were not known, how it was going about identifying the unknown facts, and what it planned to do to address the situation going forward. Identifying your goals and your desires for a better organization down the line are always important. And when you're talking about an exit strategy and you're using data to determine what your exit strategy is going to be, it's always important to communicate to people how you're going to use that data. So Joanne, you're a privacy lawyer. You certainly understand that when you acquire data about your employees, there are certain things you just have to keep in mind in terms of communicating to them that data. So, you probably have some insights on how you communicate to employees with respect to their data.
That's exactly right. And for those companies that have non-US assets and operations, the GDPR was the first law that really kind of started to impact US-based businesses, where employees have privacy rights just as much as customers do. So there was kind of a new concept for, I think, a lot of American businesses. And I went through a merger and acquisition case about 2 years ago, where it was a large M&A deal with 150 country operations, and the employees, in terms of the talent planning pre-merger and post-merger was a huge issue. And it was not a consumer-facing company. It was purely employee data, and yet it was a really a big project for the company to kind of go through, what that communication looks like, how to communicate that your position is no longer going to be with the new merged entity, etc. And I know that those are the kinds of decisions that you're making, Chris, at Crossmark, that when you are in the middle of really kind of transforming what the company does as business, how do you earn the trust of your employees? How do you earn the trust of your customers? And some of that transformation at Crossmark includes, I believe, a business strategy of data as a service, which might be a little bit different than what your business has done in the past.
Right. So I just want to build on Eric's comments, because I think he laid out some very strong principles that we're actually trying to implement. Starting with, obviously, we're a service business, so people are our business. And as we all know, disruption can bring out both the best of our people, but sometimes also the worst of our people. So the second principle that Eric laid out is honesty is the best policy. I would say communication and transparency is the way that we illustrate those points, right? So we had put in place very early a group that would be the nexus for the communication across the different stakeholders that we see in the charts in front of us here. And obviously the messaging is a little different for each of those, but consistent mindset here is that we're going to try to be transparent. Here are some decisions that we're making. Here's why we're making these decisions. And then the last point I would make is that we're fulfilling a strategy that we put in place around a methodology. So having a roadmap that you can point to and say, you know, it may feel like we're in a completely different place, but actually that's just the smoke and dust in the air. We're still moving along the same path. We still have some of the same objectives, as you said, you know, to be more data informed and use data to drive our business and our clients' business is ultimately what our objective is.
That's a really good point. I'm going to turn to you, Andrew. When you're helping companies restructure, make these kinds of reorg decisions, restructuring, or even to file bankruptcy, how important is data? You know, is quality data important in informing those roadmaps, as Chris talked about?
Sure. I think Chris and Eric have made some great points. When I think about communication and what I do, I think of credibility. I mean, communication to me is what, in a lot of cases, drives credibility and trust. And if you lose credibility with your key stakeholders, whether in my interactions, often that's with creditors or suppliers or customers, but internally with employees as well, or stockholders, I think you lose everything. And so, as far as data goes, for example, if you're working on the financial side, if data allows you to better financially model your performance, it allows you to be more accurate and more reliable with how you communicate with, again, creditors, suppliers, customers, especially in times of uncertainty like right now, where if you can be a little more accurate because of your data, you can be a little more reliable, you can be a little more trustworthy. That leads to, from my perspective, where I deal with a lot of times creditor debtor issues, it leads to consensual resolutions as opposed to heading to court and heading to litigation. It leads to finding a business resolution as opposed to litigation. And so I think, kind of as a practical tip, I guess a lot of times what we do when we come in to work with a company that's reorganizing or in financial distress, unfortunately, a lot of times we see a very scattered approach to how communication occurs rather than something real coordinated and focused and deliberate. And so one thing we try to do is establish a clear hierarchy for how communication is handled across all the constituencies you see on the slide there, because if you're communicating different things, people find out, and that, again, you lose credibility. And so a clear, consistent messaging is key, and setting up your org chart to be sure that all these issues go to the same group of people so that you get a clear and consistent message is really vital in that process. So that's kind of how I think about it, as really a credibility and a trust issue, which then drives all kinds of other outcomes from there.
That's a really good point. And in terms of having credibility and trust issues, from a privacy and a lawyer perspective, when you have personal data involved, let's say, and from an employee perspective, you know, obviously personal data, privacy laws come into play. But I've also worked with clients that are working with corporate data, you know, confidential information and trade secrets, where companies might be looking to make pricing decisions or looking to acquire another company. And, you know, how do you really think about data asset that is going to be informing your communication strategies from an IP perspective, from trade secrets perspective, and really a broader perspective of antitrust also come into play. And this time we're going to turn to our CLE code. And for those of you that are taking down the code is pivot. All right, let's go to employees. When companies are pivoting, difficult decisions often have to get made to downsize or terminate employees. And we've kind of touched on it in the earlier part of this webinar, but let's really dig into it. And Eric, this is all you. So, Chris, can you set the stage by telling us, what are some employment-related decisions that you had to make at Crossmark and how you came to those decisions?
Yeah, so Lewis had talked earlier about having a sense of how long is this going to last. And unfortunately, in this case, it was very difficult early on to determine how long this was going to last. In fact, we thought at one time it might only be a few weeks. And now, it quickly turned into a few months, and boy, is it going to be measured in years becomes now the question that we have. So when we thought about this, we actually knew that we had to maintain financial viability, number one, but we also had strategic objectives that we needed to also push forward with. And so we tried to maintain a sense of compassion for the people that were affected. As I mentioned, 40 to 45% of our people were directly in the line of fire here and needed to be furloughed. So one of the decisions we made was to maintain benefits for those people, to not put them out in the cold in the worst possible part of the winter, as it turns out, as well as repurpose some people, particularly around this push towards digital and what we're trying to do to implement our methodology for digital transformation. So a lot of that is communication, as I'm sure your audience fully understands. Digital transformation is technology, but it's also cultural change, it's business process change. So we took a lot of that in consideration as we actually implemented. And at the end of the day, it's about maintaining low cost optionality in a very uncertain environment.
That's a really good point. So Eric, can you respond to some of what Chris has said? And when you're making those decisions, those very difficult employment-related decisions,
Sure.
How do you decide which employees are key, that which employees are indispensable?
Sure. So let me dispel a myth first. A lot of people believe that the data is the data. The data doesn't lie. The data doesn't discriminate. Well, remember, data is provided by human beings. And so there's an old saying, garbage in, garbage out. You have to understand that the data that you're relying on has to be tied to something that's really material and essential and objective about your business. So when you're really deciding, you're making those difficult decisions about who is an essential employee, you should be looking at the true business functions that are necessary across your enterprise and identifying those folks that, irrespective of race or gender or national origin or age, or in some states, sexual orientation and identity, military status, place of birth or birthplace, that your data is tied to the essential functions of the job and your business and not having a disparate impact on some of those protected groups. So as a legal concept, it's always important to understand that the data is only good data if it's based upon good facts and good analysis. But certainly when we're talking about making decisions about who are the essential employees, the data will also drive decisions in terms of where is the profit margin for the enterprise. Earlier, Chris talked about incremental demand and demand driving supply and in some respects, vice versa. Well, how you deploy your human resources are going to be in part based upon that potential for incremental demand and analyzing whether those assets, those resources are properly placed. Let me give you a quick example. So there's a company here in Georgia, and I believe across parts of the Southeast, but certainly here in Atlanta, Taco Mac. Taco Mac is a sports bar type of restaurant. Well, we all know the hospitality and restaurant industry has been significantly impacted by this coronavirus pandemic. And so what Taco Mac has done is it is taken its data and realized that its takeout, its delivery service, now presents an outsized percentage of its revenue relative to where we were just 3 or 4 months ago. And so Taco Mac is now investing in and partnering with food delivery services that were kind of a tangential remote part of its business. It's now establishing true business partnerships and relationships with those types of services because the new data is telling it that that's where its profitability it's going to be, that's where its revenue stream is, and it realizes it needs to be all in, at least for the foreseeable future, on partnering with those types of companies. Now, interestingly, that raises all types of other issues because I believe Chris talked about outsourcing earlier. Well, when you invest in, partner with, in a formal kind of corporate way, companies that you used to identify as a vendor for outsourcing purposes, that raises all types of joint employer issues. To the extent folks used to be independent contractors, now you have an employer-employee relationship. So it can be complex, and I certainly don't want to suggest that you should just rush in, but all of these things are driven by the data, the costs associated with having employees versus independent contractors. And so it's important for you to dig into the data, understand the data, have an understanding of what's behind the numbers, what's behind the data, while making sure that your employment decisions are non-discriminatory and really are getting to what are the essential functions of your organization and making sure you're identifying the employees that are truly essential. And that's whether you're in a COVID environment or any type of environment where you've now got to pivot and consider exiting.
You made some really good points, Eric, and I'm thinking that you and I might need to do a separate webinar just on employment issues because you touched on some really interesting points. One, you talked about bias, and I know from a GDPR and CCPA and other privacy laws perspective, even though employees have privacy rights, where the employers now need to give notice to the employees on inferences that are made. So I know that those are very difficult conversations. How should employers, businesses notify and give disclosure to the employees on the behavioral data that's been consumed by the business to make certain decisions? And so let's kind of jump to, can you just give, I want to go to the next point in our presentation. Sure. Can you give a quick kind of a practical tips list of legal issues that come into play when you are making a decision to furlough, making a decision to hire independent contractors, or giving retention bonuses to key employees?
Sure. And so I'll walk through those quickly. So, most companies, no company wants to furlough its employees. Those are difficult decisions. And we know that 36 or maybe we're up to 37 or 38 million Americans are now filing for or have filed for unemployment in this coronavirus pandemic. So whenever you're making the decision to furlough employees, you have to make sure you're making, again, non-discriminatory decisions. And as you're looking at your workforce, making sure that you do a regressive analysis. And for those of you who aren't good at math, I recommend that you hire somebody who is good at math. But you really do need to do a regressive analysis to make sure that your furlough decisions aren't impacting protected categories of folks in a disproportionate way, because then you probably need to adjust your decision-making process. You also have to make sure you identify whether or not your furlough decisions are triggering federal or state WARN notice requirements. WARN, W-A-R-N, is the Work Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act. There's a federal WARN Act and there are state mini WARN Acts. It's a complicated calculation that we don't have time to go into today. But certainly you have to consider whether you have warrant notifications that you have to comply with on a state or federal level. When it comes to independent contractors versus employees, again, to the extent you've been outsourcing a lot of your work, are you now going to bring those employees under your corporate umbrella, or those workers that were independent contractors under your corporate umbrella? And what does that mean with respect to the employer-employee relationship? How much control are you exercising over the day-to-day work of those employees that you may not have exercised control over? So those joint employer issues come into play when you're identifying independent contractors. And I want to go back to one of the points that I think we've all touched on is, honesty. Nothing undermines employee morale like furloughing a percentage of your workforce and then hiring outsourcing companies to come in and do that same job because it's cheaper from a benefit standpoint or even from an hourly standpoint. That nothing undermines morale more than that. So you really do have to consider how you go about doing this. And if we have some time, I'd certainly be interested in hearing Chris's thoughts on that. The other thing I'll finish up with, which is a related point, is whenever you're restructuring, you're exiting, you need people to carry out the plan. Whether it's a bankruptcy or a restructuring, you got to have workers to maintain the business and keep the business afloat while you're furloughing folks. And sometimes you need to engage people, incentivize people in a way that they'll stick around when everyone knows that the boat is taking on water. Someone's got to bail and someone's got to work on the repairs. And so incentivizing those folks with retention bonuses or stay bonuses or the like is something that you'll have to manage your way through. And I'm sure Andrew can talk about the fact that when you're before a bankruptcy judge and you're asking a bankruptcy judge to discharge certain credit obligations, balancing that argument with the argument that you are also paying some of your C-suite folks or even some of your managers and supervisors retention bonuses while you're laying off and discharging other credit obligations. It's a balancing act. It's threading the needle. Having litigators, employment lawyers who understand that process and how to make those arguments to bankruptcy judges is always something that you have to consider. So, it's a difficult process to communicate how you're going to furlough employees while at the same time keeping the business afloat and running so that you'll come out the other side a better and stronger organization.
That's a really good point. So let's turn to restructuring. Back to you, Chris. So when Crossmark was going through restructuring, how do you identify what is working and what is not working, and how do you structure for success? What are some assumptions that you were working with, and how do companies make sure that you're not working with incomplete or biased data?
Well, that's quite a hard question, and it's very similar to the kind of work that I would have done at Alvarez and Marsal. I'm sure Louis can speak volumes to this as well, right? Because as you are entering the phase of either restructuring or bankruptcy, it very much is in the favor of, the company wants to portray itself as a good business with a bad balance sheet, right? And I think, in fact, our company is a good company with a bad balance sheet. But what I needed to be aware of is where deferred maintenance was probably pushed a bit too far. And so some of that becomes apparent through dashboard scorecards, the financial statements that you see, some parts of the business struggling more than others. But infrastructure, I'll give just one example. As the company was trying desperately to avoid bankruptcy, which it did, and went through a financial restructuring, it left the windows and doors unlocked, meaning we were open to security breaches. And we found ourselves, ironically, on March 10th, we were brought to our knees through ransomware, through a cyber attack. Now, luckily, we had started, and I kind of knew that the possibility existed that we had deferred maintenance in some non-visible areas. So we did an assessment, called upon an outside third party to come in and do an assessment of our IT infrastructure. And basically the assessment came back and said, hey, your data, your platform is pretty good. Where you're probably at risk is in security and infrastructure. And sure enough, 2 weeks later, we got hit. So it's always interesting to see what kind of snakes are under the rocks.
That's
You don't know.
absolutely right. Your point about deferred maintenance is a really, really insightful, Chris, because, especially when you have, low cash, propositions right now, I think it's difficult to decide where to invest and where not to. And as you learned from your company that perhaps, security and infrastructure is the area that you would want to invest in because it would have kind of bottom line impact on your company. Let's turn to bankruptcy and to Andrew. I know that a lot of companies think about bankruptcy as the last option, and it's maybe a dirty word that not a lot of people like to talk about. But I know that you talk about bankruptcy as an effective tool, one of the effective tools for restructuring. So when should companies consider bankruptcy?
I think that's a complicated question. I think overall that a lot of factors go into, but I think anytime a company is really looking to reorganize, and I think like Chris mentioned, most companies would prefer to do that in an out of court situation if possible. But really, when you're sitting down to think about how to restructure your business, at a high level, I think of that as your company being at point A and identifying what point B is, and then how you get there. I think bankruptcy, or at least advisors that are aware of the benefits of bankruptcy and counsel, just needs to be part of that consideration, because when you're moving through restructuring the company, there's some things that you think of as fixed costs or things that are not changeable or not easily changeable outside of a bankruptcy. An example I think of, recently you've had J. Crew file, you had Neiman Marcus file. Those companies were largely defined by these big kind of fixed obligations for leases that probably run out for years, typically at malls. Outside of a bankruptcy context, you can go to every single landlord and try to negotiate a new deal. There's not much incentive for the landlords to work with you, and so the only way that that's possible, or one of the main benefits of the bankruptcy in this situation would be you can step into bankruptcy and then get out of those leases through something called rejecting the leases in the bankruptcy code. But that would allow a company, for example, J. Crew, if they have 500 retail locations in the United States, to take a look at its portfolio and say, we're going to keep 200 of these, and we're going to, we've called pivot from a bricks and mortar type operation into an online platform based business. And that's a lot of what we're seeing as these early Chapter 11s roll in as a result of COVID. Some of these bricks and mortar businesses are transforming really into more of an online presence, and it's just nearly impossible to do that outside of a bankruptcy. And so I guess the overall point would be, we see too often that people don't consider bankruptcy as an option until perhaps it's too late. And it doesn't necessarily mean the business is dying. It can be a rebirth or a transformation into a new form. I think Chris made a good point that you hear a lot in bankruptcies is that bankruptcy is very good at fixing balance sheets, but it's not going to fix your P&L. It's not going to bring more dollars in the door necessarily, but it is really good at balance sheet issues and kind of big fixed costs and obligations that you can modify really only in the bankruptcy context. And so those are a couple things that I think are beneficial about a bankruptcy and something that should be considered. Obviously, the individual circumstances of when it makes sense and things like that are very fact specific, but in general, bankruptcy has a number of benefits that I could talk about for another hour or two, but I think it just needs to be part of the conversation when you're thinking about transforming your business, where there are things that are difficult to modify outside of bankruptcy. Bankruptcy may give you options to transform your business in ways that are just otherwise not possible.
Andrew, I think we should do another webinar on bankruptcy.
All right.
And I
Now
know
we're
that
talking.
you have. I know that the bankruptcy group has been really focused on, especially in the COVID response. Let's go to special situations and distress M&A, and then staying with you, Andrew. When you are looking at bankruptcy proceedings, but also in special situation mergers or acquisitions, how are IT, IP, and data assets evaluated? And if you are a company that's looking to be acquired, you're not going down the bankruptcy path, but you are looking to be acquired, or maybe you're looking to fundraise, what are some practical tips that you have to get your affairs in order?
Yeah, so when the way I think about it is that these assets are kind of valued the way that they're valued, and it doesn't necessarily change in a distressed environment. If you have a company in financial distress, for example, in a bankruptcy case, you typically would have a shorter due diligence period and things like that as part of what's called a Section 363 sale in the bankruptcy context. So in situations like that, you have a very compressed time period, and so it would perhaps depress market value some because you don't have the same ability to do long-term due diligence that you would outside the bankruptcy. But the flip side of that is as a distressed asset buyer, sometimes a bankruptcy or an insolvency situation is an opportunity to come in and perhaps acquire assets quicker and faster and cheaper than you could in other situations. So I think the way, at least me as a bankruptcy lawyer, I think of the assets as kind of what they are, and they're kind of valued in that manner, and not necessarily dependent on what type of asset it is, but the market really dictates what it's worth and the best outcome in a bankruptcy type situation.
That's an interesting point, because I think a lot of the questions that I'm getting from a privacy law perspective is the value of the consumer data. And so maybe that's an area where the companies, that there is room, that maybe assets are not the way they are, because how a value of the consumer data is really evaluated may be different than sometimes. And so I think it does require some work, some due diligence to think through, what kinds of data do you have? And we're starting to get a lot of questions on that. What are some data that you have, kind of the way that, Chris, you're looking at your data assets? If your business has been in business for 100 years and you have probably the best, retail data set of any company, is that something that is going to be valuable? And how do you kind of evaluate the value of that when you're looking at restructuring and fundraising? To Louis, what are some practical tips that you would give to companies that are looking to sell? Would you say that that basically in the market, if you're looking to sell right now, are you going to be assumed that you are distressed, and therefore are you not going to get value for your company? And what are some approaches that you see your clients taking?
Sorry, the question was directed to me.
Yeah.
Yep. So yeah, I mean, in terms of just IT, IP, and data assets, and selling companies right now, I mean, I think it's always just a focus to basics. So on the financial side of things, making sure that your accounting software is up to date and is capable of providing granular information, especially if you've got different different divisions that are part of your company. I'm working on an IP sale right now for a company that's distressed, and the company was going through is going through a lot of liquidity issues. But as it happens, when we hired a law firm to do some diligence on the IP patents, we found out that they weren't properly filed with the U.S. IP, with the patent office rather. So that essentially took, I would say 2 to 3 weeks for us to deal with a lot of these problems, where that really impacted the value of the business because we couldn't get out and start our sales process in the way that we wanted to. On the CRM side, I've noticed, in doing deals with businesses that are distressed, that they're just not up to date. So, for customer-centric businesses, they should accurately capture customer data. If you have separate divisions, along the lines of financial software, making sure that data can be easily extracted. So if you're, at times in bankruptcy, we're selling, as opposed to selling the whole business, we're selling parts of it. So understanding how you can, extrapolate that data and look at it on an isolated basis is critical to any sale of the company. And then the last part on the IT and sort of technology stack is also really understanding that your system can generate trends, during due diligence that would be interesting to buyers. Some of this stuff is what I would say pretty basic diligence information, but you would be surprised with how many of our clients just lack some of those basic kind of tools in the way that they run their operation. So.
Thanks for that. And we're going to go to the last slide. I know that we're out of time. And Chris, I'm going to ask you the last question. Data monetization. I know that throughout the entire webinar today, we've been talking a lot about issues, involving data from bankruptcy and restructuring, employment, and from an IP and other issues. The question that I get the most from our clients is that sometimes the role of the legal department is really crucial. When you're looking at restructuring, when you're looking at when to file a bankruptcy, or when you're doing those, pivoting and accelerating type of decisions, I've seen a lot of the lawyers. I had this one example from last week where a client said that they had hired a lawyer to look at data monetization strategy for the company. The company is handling healthcare related data. And the advice that he got was to say that HIPAA didn't apply, and HIPAA is a specifically healthcare-related entity, covered entity, and business associate requirement. And since HIPAA, the person that they had asked for advice was a HIPAA lawyer, and so he said HIPAA doesn't apply, and so you can move forward. And the client knew that it wasn't just HIPAA, it was CCPA, it was GDPR. What about trade secrets? What about the fact that you might be violating some antitrust issues? So I think it's really important to kind of have that holistic mindset when you're looking at data and using it in an innovative way. And sometimes the role of the legal department is really important to anticipate these issues and to really kind of set the company in the right path. So as the CEO, you get the last word. What do you see as a role that legal department can play to help kind of really shepherd the business when you're making these difficult decisions, when you're looking to transform, when you're looking to pivot and accelerate?
Well, that could be another webinar, I think, but
we're up to 4.
I think each one of the panelists, I think, have brought up specific issues, that need to be weighed. I think a lot of times it's context, right? So in the case of right now, disruption leading to a bankruptcy, for example, where Andrew was talking about, there's 2 things that really could be addressed through bankruptcy, right? Fix your balance sheet and change some long-term agreements that you have in place that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do. I think as we talk about data has the power and the potential to disrupt business models. And it's important to have, as I do, have an in-house GC that I talk to on a very regular basis, as well as external experts to draw upon for specific needs. So the GC needs to understand this is a big issue. I understand that our business model is going to change, and therefore we may need to change the way our contracts are written. What are our options? In all likelihood, the GC probably doesn't have that expertise specifically. We need to leverage an outside expert. So I think part of that, just like as a CEO does, is understand the context and the relevant issues. When is it that it can be handled internally? When do you need to go to outside experts? And what are your options, how to proceed?
Thanks for that, Chris. And that is the end of our webinar. Hopefully we gave you some interesting insights. And the last CLE code is accelerate. Thanks for joining us today. And if you have any questions, please reach out, and I look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.